My name is Lisa, and this is Freedom Grows. Today, I wanted to talk about a really special plant, and it is something that I do not normally grow here in my little garden. I am used to growing food and herbs, things that we can consume, but not so much plants that consume other things. So, I am actually talking about the beautiful, carnivorous, endangered Venus flytrap. They are endangered because of habitat destruction. So we as humans want to populate everything. And unfortunately, in removing all of the little bogs and natural areas to create roads and houses, it has obviously killed off a lot of these beautiful plants in our wild here in the United States. Also, fire suppression. These plants actually do need fire, and we have been suppressing fires over the decades, and unfortunately over collection. People have this inclination of poaching them and collecting them illegally. So if you are out in North Carolina or South Carolina and you're in a little boggy area and you come across one of these plants in the wild, it is actually illegal for you to remove it from the ground. We have already done enough damage to these plants, and it's best to let them continue to grow wild naturally and hopefully multiply. So I got this little guy from a nursery, and I have a couple more that are a little bit smaller. One of them is really stressed out. It was kind of just abandoned and had a lot of little, black traps, and it really just didn't look good. So I'm working on reviving that one. And then I received one in the mail, which was a much smaller seedling. I want to first talk about this beautiful plant, where it comes from, all that good stuff. The scientific name, I'm going to put it on the screen because I don't think I can actually pronounce it. I'll try. It's Dione muscipula. Yep, I butchered that. It's a small perennial plant that is native to the United States in the coastal areas of North Carolina. They're also found in South Carolina along the same coastal areas. It lives on the outbanks of rivers, lakes, and in bogs. And it can live as long as 20 years or more in its natural habitat. And each plant has multiple traps, like what you see here, their mouths. And each trap can only open and close so many times before that particular trap dies off. It ends up turning black and then kind of just dying. But then during the next blooming season, it'll sprout new traps, and it naturally lives in really nutrient poor conditions. So it can't really tolerate minerals or fertilizers. And you'll soon learn more about why it's really picky about its soil and water and even the container that it's growing in because of that. A topic I find a hot topic that isn't really discussed much, but I definitely wanted to discuss it, is if they eat pollinators. That is a question that is important to me because I do grow food and I do want to naturally bring in the bees and the butterflies, the ladybugs, all the beneficial insects to the garden for food growing purposes and because they're just beautiful and I love them. And they actually do not. Like almost all carnivorous plants, they have basic mechanisms that help them separate prey versus pollinator. And one of those mechanisms is that they have flowers as well, which you're not seeing here, but they do produce flowers that are much higher above the traps. And those flowers are the ones that attract the pollinators. Now, their traps, which you see here, they are closer to the ground, which attract the crawling insects. And one other that I wanted to touch on is that the flowers produce pollen or nectar that attracts those pollinators, while the traps don't produce pollen. They produce a scent or a color that attract prey. They truly are smart plants, and they don't want to eat anything that contains their own pollen. So no need to worry for those gardeners that do want to attract beneficial pollinators and insects to their garden. This will not have a negative effect. Now, do accidents happen? Of course they do, but it's more of an exception, not the rule. When it comes to their containers, you're going to want to use plastic or a glazed ceramic. This here looks like terracotta, but it's not. It's actually plastic. What you don't want to do is grow them in terracotta or unglazed ceramic or clay, because those are porous and unwanted minerals can actually leach into the container and it can kill the plant. The plants are going to need a container about 5 to 6 inches wide and deep in order to grow properly and happily. And as for the soil, what you're seeing here is the original soil that this plant came in, and then the soil that I put together when I up potted this plant. It came in a very small 2-inch container. So because they are very sensitive to minerals, you'll want to also be really careful with what you use to grow them. Now, there are some pre-mixes that are sold on the market for these type of plants, but if you're making your own, which is what I did, you'll want a combination of sphagnum peat moss and some perlite. You can also use like silica sand or coarse sand, but I didn't do that. I just mixed sphagnum peat moss with some perlite, but I went an extra step that may not be required. I actually flushed it with zero mineral water before I transplanted this plant into this soil. And the reason why I flushed it was because I wanted to remove any possible lingering toxins or minerals that may have been in this media before I actually place the plant in here. Now, sphagnum peat moss doesn't have minerals like regular potting soil has, which is why you want to go with something like that. Now, there are other options, and again, there are some growing medias that you can purchase online specifically for carnivorous plants. Now, at the big box stores, I noticed there were 2 options for peat moss. Now, I don't know if it's just in my area, but you either had the big bale of peat moss, which I didn't need, but the other option at the big box store was a brand that is well known in the gardening world, and it was a smaller bag, but that one contained extra fertilizers in there, and you don't want anything that has fertilizers in it. So you make sure that you are purchasing 100% sphagnum peat moss and no added fertilizers. So I couldn't purchase anything at the store. I had to actually go online. I bought a smaller bag. It's like a 4-quart bag through Amazon, and I just made sure that it didn't have fertilizers in it. The next topic I want to discuss is all about watering. Now, out in the wild, these live on the outbanks of rivers and lakes and in bogs, so they always want to stay moist. So you want to place a tray underneath the container and preferably water the tray with about a ½ inch or an inch of water. You can water from the top, but I prefer to just water from the bottom. And when it comes to the type of water, they are very sensitive to that as well. They can obviously take rainwater. If you are collecting rainwater, just make sure you're not giving them rainwater that you've collected from any gutters or your roof, because impurities from your roof and gutters can actually leach into that water. Yes, they are that sensitive. Or they can take distilled water, reverse osmosis if you have something like that, or something like this, which is my zero water filter, which we also use for our drinking water. This filter removes all of the minerals and any impurities in the water, and it actually comes with a TDS meter so that you can make sure that it is reading 0 total dissolved solids. I tested my tap water and it was reading at about 195 parts per million. And then I went ahead and ran the water through this filter, tested the water once it was filtered, and it was registering at 0. So that's what you want. You want something that is less than 30 parts per million. So this 0 water filter works out great. You don't want to let the media here completely dry out, because if it goes one day completely dry, you risk killing the plant. It always needs to stay damp or moist, but not waterlogged. So if you place an inch of water in here and then you come back tomorrow and that water is still in there, you may want to dump a little bit out, but carefully watch it so that it doesn't dry out completely. Now let's talk food. How do they get their food? What is their primary source of food? All that fun stuff. Their main source of food is the sun. They need full sun, about 8 to 14 hours a day. It can be dappled light, if you're placing it under a tree or something that gets partial shade, partial sun. But if you're growing them indoors, place them on a south facing windowsill if possible, or get yourself some really good grow lights. But when the sun or the light is not enough, that's when they usually supplement their diets with bugs. Now, they can actually go their entire lives without eating one bug and survive just fine. That's just an added treat. Basically, the bugs give them some supplemental nutrients that they may need, but that's about it. Remember, they cannot tolerate fertilizers, whether it's organic or not, that we would normally give to our fruiting plants. So if you're growing these outdoor, you'll likely never have to feed them insects because they're great at catching their own. They have, of course, as you can see here, attractive colors, and they excrete a very sweet nectar that lures their prey in. But if you're planning on growing them indoors, you're probably wondering if you can feed them bugs. And of course you can, but you don't want to feed them all. So like if you're going to feed them a bug, you may want to feed one trap and that's it. And they require a lot of energy to digest bugs and they don't need that much. So just one trap is enough. And you may be wondering if you can feed them dead bugs. Some people are a little squirmy when it comes to handling little live insects. And the answer to that question isn't as easy as yes or no, but it's best to give them access to or to feed them live ones. If you're feeding them dead insects, the longer that insect has been dead, the less nutrients it contains for the fly trap. So it's best to give them ones that have recently died, which of course you're not always going to know that unless you've killed them yourself, which I know isn't wonderful. When you're feeding them the insects, make sure that you choose ones that are less than half of the head size or the size of the trap, because they need to be able to fully close their traps around the insect in order to properly digest it. So good insects would be things like flies or little spiders, mealworms, little crickets, but don't feed them any hard-shelled insects like snails or, beetles with a hard shell, or even live ants. I know a lot of people have success with feeding theirs live ants, but I will err on the side of safety and exclude them from their diet because they actually have been known to eat their way out of the trap. Feeding them dead insects is more of a process because you're going to have to stimulate them as if you were mimicking a live insect, and I'll explain why. So for instance, if I were to have a dead fly and I place the fly inside of its trap, it might be hard to see, but they have these little hairs inside of their trap. Each trap has about 3 little hairs, and when the fly or the insect touches those hairs, it will stimulate the fly trap to close itself. So that is the first response. If the insect were to be alive, it would normally squirm inside for at least a minute before dying, which then triggers the fly trap's second response of releasing its digestive enzymes in order to start breaking down the insect. But since this insect that we are feeding them, hypothetically speaking, is dead, then that second response will not be triggered. So you have to trigger it and act like there's an actual live bug in there in order for it to release that second response. So what you want to do is essentially place the bug in there, make sure that it closes, and then start with your finger or a Q-tip or something, kind of massaging the outside of the trap's head for about 30 seconds. So that way it thinks that, hey, there's a bug in there, it's alive, and now let me go ahead and release my second response of releasing those digestive enzymes to start breaking this bug down. The reason it needs that second response is because when it closes its trap like this, and when it comes to digesting food, it needs and uses a lot of energy to digest it. And it doesn't want to waste that energy trying to digest something that it doesn't need. Like if a raindrop were to fall, into the trap, or maybe like a leaf from outside were to fall into it. When those things happen, the plant will not spend the extra energy of trying to digest it by releasing those enzymes. So eventually it'll just open its mouth back up again, which can take a day or two. But with a live bug, it releases those enzymes, and that will take about a week or sometimes even more to break that bug down. And then it opens back up. And so when it opens back up, what you'll likely see is like the exoskeleton of the insect. You can just leave it alone because you don't want to accidentally trigger the trap to close back up, or you can gently, blow it off, or if it's outside, it'll just fly away on its own with wind. But remember, it can only open and close their traps so many times before that specific trap dies off. So feed them sparingly, randomly. Again, most of their nutrition comes from photosynthesis, from the sun. They create their own nutrition, and again, they can go their entire lives without eating an insect. It is important to harden off your plants, just like you would your cuttings or seedlings or little transplants that you are initially starting indoors and then bringing them outdoors. Same concept applies. It's really important to harden these guys off, which is the process of slowly introducing it to the sun over about a week's time, or else you can risk it burning and dying. So give it about 2 hours of sun today and maybe tomorrow, and then 3 hours the next day, and then 4 hours the next day, and so on. Now let's talk dormancy. In its natural environment, it goes through a dormancy period for about 3 to 4 months. Once the temperatures outside dip below 45 degrees, what happens is the plant will start to die back, and then it'll emerge again in the springtime. So again, it's a perennial. It will come back. A lot of people just toss their plant out thinking, oh, it died, but it's not. It's just dormant. And in North Carolina and even South Carolina, they get a proper winter, but here in Florida, we don't. Our winters are really mild and short. Those cold temperatures below 45 degrees do not last 3 to 4 months here. Yeah, we do get freezing temperatures, few days out of the winter, but we can actually mimic a true proper dormancy by placing these in the refrigerator. So dormancy is actually really important for these perennials to thrive for many, many years. And if they skip dormancy, they may live healthy, but only for a couple of years to a few years before they eventually die. So dormancy is really important for them to come back stronger and bigger the following years. If you enjoyed the information in this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. It does help the channel long term, and I also appreciate your support. Thank you for being here, and until next time.